Good morning. It is good to be with you. I'm especially glad to not be on a plane right now. I was sitting in the airport. My wife, we drove from family camp up in Wisconsin. We're heading on our way back to Kansas. She dropped me off at the airport in Madison, and I got a notification that my flight was delayed for a couple hours. And I thought, no big deal. I'm supposed to arrive around 5 p.m. And then I got another notification that it was delayed again. And I look at the thing, my boarding pass, and I'm like, how am I supposed to land at this time and get to the next flight that leaves in like 20 minutes? Like it was going to be a very, very tight window. And so we take off, land in Chicago O'Hare, and I get a text from United that says, it takes 19 minutes to walk to your next destination. And I think the plane was taking off in like 15 minutes. So I made the awesome fashion choice of wearing sandals and socks in the airport. I'm sprinting through the airport in my sandals. I looked ridiculous. But I made it with like 2 minutes to spare. I was sweating. The person next to me, I'm sure, was not thrilled that I was just like completely sweating the entire time. But I'm glad to be here. It's a weird feeling that I am not flying back to Kansas. This is it. I'm here. My family's going to be joining me really soon. I'm very excited for you all for you who haven't met them yet. They're really excited. It's going to be wonderful to have them. We're looking at this morning. It's interesting. This transition that's taking place between Rick and I. It's really an interesting moment for this church and for me. We're actually going to be looking at the ending of Jesus' greatest sermon. I don't know if you can think back to your favorite sermon you've ever heard. I remember in seminary in my homiletics class, there's this legendary preacher from Gordon Conwell named Hayden Robinson. Maybe you've heard of him. But one of our homiletics is just a fancy word for preaching. And so we had a preaching class, and it was during COVID, so everything was on Zoom, and we all sat on a Zoom call together and watched one of his sermons. And it was like a 12-minute sermon. You know you're a good preacher when you can preach in 12 minutes. And it was on Mary and Martha. And it spoke so deeply to the future pastors in the room that when he ended the sermon, like you looked at the Zoom call and like everybody was crying. Maybe you have a sermon that you can look back in your history and remember. Well, this particular sermon that Jesus preaches is like his greatest sermon of all time. The Sermon on the Mount, obviously we're not going to cover anything but the ending today. Maybe someday we'll go back and do the whole thing. But the ending is really, really profound, and I think it sets the stage for all of us because it ends in such a strange and abrupt and jarring way. It's not a pep talk or a rally or a story, but it ends with a series of warnings. And we're not going to look at all the warnings. We're just going to look at the last one this morning. Before I do that, I want to set the stage for us and kind of name the cultural moment that we're in. A guy by the name of Buckminster Fuller, he's the guy who invented I'm going to mess up what it's called, the geodesic dome. You guys, if you've ever been to Disney World, you've seen something like this. The guy was a genius. He did a lot of writing as well, and one of the things that he came up with was this idea called the knowledge doubling curve. And here's what he suggested in his research. He estimated that from the year of Jesus' birth, it took 1,500 years for the cumulative knowledge of all mankind to double. Think about that for a second. 1,500 years is a long time. But in his estimation, it took that long for all of the information in the world to double. And then he said things started to speed up. He said from there on, it took about 250 years for information to double. And then by basically 100 years every year from that until World War II, and then it was every 25 years. And now most sociologists agree that the amount of information that we have in the world doubles every 12 hours. Now you can probably discern why. We live in the information age, the age of the internet. But the reality is this: we have more information than ever before. Thomas Friedman, he's a journalist for the New York Times and author. He writes about the age of acceleration. So not only are we in the age of information, but we're also in the age of acceleration. Everything has sped up to breakneck speed. Things happen more quickly, they're automated. It's amazing what ChatGPT and other tools can do in about 5 seconds that would have taken, a handwritten something hours and hours. And because of this, and because technology is changing so rapidly, if you look at the bell curve, it's unbelievable how quickly the curve goes up, right? It was steady, 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 and then the Industrial Revolution, and then the internet age, and all of a sudden, it's at a pace that we cannot keep up with. When they released the last version of ChatGPT, I think it was like 4.0, this is a couple of years, this is like a year and a half ago, they released this thing, and one of the people who was working on it from Google, I forget what his name was, but he said, it's scary at this point because we don't know how it's learning. It's kind of terrifying. But it's learning so fast that even the ones who put it into motion don't know how it's learning. This is creating in our culture what we call the age of anxiety. And it certainly plays a pivotal role. You know that in Gen Z and even in the millennial generation, their mental health issues are on the rise with anxiety and depression unlike any generation has seen before. And it points to a really unique reality that we have more information than we could ever handle, and that we're getting this information more quickly than we can handle. We're chronically behind the curve. And so because of this, there's one other factor that I want to just throw in there for you to consider, and that's a guy by the name of Neil Postman. He was a cultural commentator. He wrote the book Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he coined this phrase, information to action ratio. Okay, and I want to read this quote from Neil. The tie between information and action has been severed. Information is now a commodity that can be bought and sold or used as a form of entertainment or worn like a garment to enhance one's status. It comes indiscriminately, directed to no one in particular, disconnected from usefulness. We are gutted with information, drowning in information, have no control over it, and don't know what to do with it. Interestingly, Neil points to not the cell phone, the smartphone, as sort of the catalyst in this, but actually goes all the way back to something called the telegraph. Have you ever seen one of these? Look, I'm old enough to remember, like when I got my first phone, it was like one that flipped open. It was a flip phone. I even remember before that, if I had to call a friend to want to like hang out, I would have to go to the wall and like pull the phone from the wall with a cord. I'm like old enough to know what that is. And I have to dial actual numbers and call. I had to memorize phone numbers, which is, I think I know my wife's number and that's it today. The telegraph was a way to communicate for the first time that could remove you from your time and your place. Here's what I mean by that. So let's say you lived in a town and all of a sudden you're at the post office and there are physical people there with you. And one of them says, hey, did you hear Jerry's barn is on fire? And you're like, oh, well, let's do something about it. And so what do? You go over to Jerry's barn, you grab buckets, you fill them with water, and you pour it on the fire. There was information, and you did something with that information. Interestingly, in today's culture, what happens? We get information way too fast, there's way too much of it, and there's really not a whole lot we can do. I mean, take the example of Jerry's fire. We might tweet #JusticeForJerry to like show our support for Jerry and his barn, but like when we see things happening throughout the world, whether that's the war in Israel and Palestine, whether that's Russia, Ukraine, whether that's inflation or an election season or whatever is going on, we're constantly inundated with thing after thing after thing. And there's this low hum of anxiety that is cultivated in us because we have an inability to be able to respond to it. We weren't created for that amount of information. Why am I sharing all of this with you? I think it's helpful because Jesus is going to consistently show us a different way of being in the world, a different way of living in the world, a different kind of foundation by which we can build our life upon. And not only are we living in a life where we're constantly receiving all this information, we're living in a world where our young people are being discipled by podcasters and influencers and voices in the world that are completely detached from any kind of reality. And so we need to come back to Jesus' teachings and we need to take them very seriously. And this isn't a warm, fluffy sermon this morning because Jesus isn't very warm and fluffy. He just ends this in a very kind of mic drop moment, right? Where he says, look, if your house is built on the sand, it's going to crash. And then he walks away. Now, Matthew's a literary genius. There's some really interesting things about this passage that we'll do a little bit of context here. There are 5 blocks, 5 teachings. And the literary style of Matthew, they use a lot of numerology, which is just a way of communicating where numbers had more significance than they do maybe today. Each teaching ends with a little phrase. If you read through the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus had finished saying these things, and then that kind of marks the end of it. It means you've ended the block and you go on to the next. Now, interestingly, the 5 blocks of Matthew mirror the 5 blocks of the Torah. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there's a mirroring going on. And so it's like, it's Matthew's literary way of saying that Jesus is the new Moses. He's leading a new Exodus. He's teaching a new Torah to a new Israel. And it's going to completely transform the way people think and see the law and see the world. And so you have these numbers, and I won't take too long on this, but there's 7 and 3, which were significant because they represented numbers of completion, okay? So what you have in Matthew is actually 14 sets of 3. Now, I want to give you a quote from one of my professors at Fuller. His name was Dr. Glenn Stasis. He said, to Matthew, in his Jewish culture, 7 is a number of completeness and goodness, like the 7 days in which God created the earth. 14 is double completeness and goodness. 3 is also a number of completeness. So 3 times 14 is triply, doubly complete. It is good, really good. All to say, when Jesus says these words of mine, those carry significant meaning. It's not all he has to say about the kingdom, but I would argue that it is the best of what he has to say about living in the kingdom of God. It's the center of gravity for Jesus and his way of teaching how we are to live in this world. And he says, whoever hears these words of mine, but then what? Puts them into practice. It's actually one word in the Greek. Put them into practice is poieto. It means put them into practice, to take what you've heard and to do it. So it's not enough to just hear information, right? Jesus isn't just there to inform you, but also to form you. And we are formed not just by knowing how to do something, but by actually doing it. I've learned this very much with my son. I love to take my sons golfing, and I let them drive the golf cart every now and then. I can tell them how to drive a golf cart, but until they actually drive it, I am risking my life. I mean, we have run into trees. We have had some very close calls and close encounters. At one point, one of my sons was pushing the gas while my other one was driving because I couldn't reach it. And I was like, this is not going to end well. But there is an element to learning how to do something, but then actually going out and doing it. And so he tells this story. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. And then he says that again. Listen, verse 26. But everyone who hears these words of mine, but does not put them into practice, sapoieto, is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew, and it fell with a great crash. Many of you perhaps have heard this taught in like a Sunday school setting. When I was in Sunday school, they had these things called flannelgraphs. Anybody remember these? It's like a green felt wall with little like sticky things. This story was never taught in the way that I think Jesus intended it, which was meant to be more of a warning. Not some nice little story, but no, this is very serious. It's a story about there are 2 home builders. One was foolish. The word wise in the Greek is the word phronimos, which is translated as smart, thoughtful, and enlightened. But then there's the word foolish, which is moros. It's where we get the word moron. And that's translated as stupid, unthoughtful, not enlightened, right? So they're not just moral words, but they're actual mental words to describe one's thought and how they think about the world. Dr. Bruner said this: Jesus does not contrast good and bad in the parable, but thoughtful and foolish. There is an intelligence in morality, and there is a morality in general intelligence. And so this is an idea I think that we need to recapture, that as human beings, we're not as evolved as we like to think we are. Our minds and our bodies have been corrupted by sin. And in Jesus' day, it was the same way. If someone who thought they lived well and was the word is wise man or phronimos, was a wise woman, or someone who didn't was a fool or a moron. But these words were kind of like buzzwords in ancient Jewish literature. And so Jesus is tapping into this conversation that had been happening among the rabbis and among the people at the time. And so it was very much language that the people would have resonated with. And then he uses this metaphor of the home. So when we think about a house, we just bought a house, really exciting. And we got the key on Saturday, and that's going to be the place, the primary residence where my family is going to live, but it's really just our family. In ancient times, a home was much more than just a place for your immediate family. It housed your often cousins, sisters, brothers, grandparents, great-grandparents. It was multi-generational. It was where you would do your business. So it wasn't like you would, get in your car and drive to work to do your job. Your work happened from your home. It was all of life. And so the metaphor of a home is not just some place where you go after work. No, your home was your entire life. And so this metaphor takes on a bigger reality. Notice the wise person builds their house on the bedrock of Jesus' teachings, which he just did for the last 6 chapters in Matthew. The foolish man does nothing. Notice Jesus does not say why. Maybe they're tired, they're overwhelmed, maybe they prefer a different teacher or rabbi. Maybe they love their sinful lifestyle and they're like, nah, you know what, I love this too much to give it away. Jesus doesn't say, which I think is kind of brilliant because it allows us to see ourselves in this story. Are you the wise builder? Are you the fool? Where do you belong in this story? And the terrifying thing is from a distance, you can't really tell. Some people seem to have their life put together. They seem to be religious, they dress well, they look well, but the reality is their life is built on a foundation of sand. I recently went through flooding in Wichita, we don't get floods very often. But the thing about a flash flood, is it happens way quicker than you realize. If you follow the news, maybe you tracked what was happening in Texas. There's just terrible, terrible stuff with the flooding. And it happened so fast that no one knew how to respond. Well, I'm thinking to myself, as the water is starting to rise, I'm thinking, this isn't good. We're in the process of moving, and I had these 6 paper trash bags sitting out there full of leaves and brush. We were trying to get our house ready. And I look out our window, and they're just floating away. And the trash truck was supposed to come that day. And so I'm like, well, this is kind of scary. And then our basement started to get water. And I knew I needed to get our girls who were at the church, at their daycare. So I drove to the church. And as I got to the first crossroads, I realized I'm not able to drive. Like the water was so high, there was no way I was going to be able to get there. Interestingly, there were parts of Wichita, I eventually got there. I saved my children. I was a hero. Braved the elements. But it did take me an hour when it normally takes me like 5 minutes. So it was definitely an adventure. But interestingly, in Wichita, there were houses that had completely collapsed because of the water. And they were, funny enough, not old 100-year homes, but they were newer builds. But it was interesting, the way they were built was probably not built on the right kind of foundation. And so on the outside, they look fine, but when they're actually faced with the elements, when they're faced with the storms, the reality of what those houses were built on turns out to be true. So it is with our lives. And the other thing is, This passage historically has been interpreted not just for a literal physical storm, but metaphorically. So whether the storm in your life is a terminal diagnosis, whether it's unemployment, whether it's a collapse of a marriage, whether it's the death of a dream or a loss of a loved one, the reality is all of us in the human condition are going to experience difficult and hard things. It's not a matter of if you experience, it's when. That's part of what it means to be human. And so Jesus will never mince his words, which is what I love about his teaching. He's brutally honest about the human conditioning. When you have trouble, he says, and in this case, when the storms come, his way does not lead you out of the storm. This is important. His way does not lead you out of the storm, but through it. So he doesn't just remove us from hardship and difficult things, but rather he comes alongside us, offers us his presence, and walks with us through these difficult things. And all of it, if our life is built on a foundation that is of his teaching, then we'll be ready for it. This goes right in the face of, I think, some popular teaching in the West, the sort of prosperity gospel, right? That God exists, wants you to have your best life so you can be wealthy, healthy, and happy. And while God certainly might give you those things, there's also another reality to it. And that's there is going to be times of hardship because the flood is coming and it will shake your life to your core. And when it does, it'll reveal exactly the foundation in which your life is on. It'll either reveal that your life is built around your success, wealth accumulation, greed, materialism, winning, getting ahead, or your life is built around sex, beauty, youth, your appearance, popularity, what people think of you, hedonism, how to just enjoy all things in the good life, or to reveal that your foundation is that on Christ Jesus himself. The Greek word that Jesus uses here is megale, which is kind of how it sounds. It's a mega crash, a great crash. It all comes crashing down like that. Now, the scriptures, I think Jesus wants us to feel a little bit unsettled by it. I think that there is a sort of a jarring nature to the way he just sort of ends it. And if you do not do this, your house will just collapse. And then he just drops the mic and walks away. And I think that's intentional because he wants us to sit in that unsettled feeling. We use the term often, the fear of the Lord. Do you fear the Lord? And sometimes we try to explain away what fear means. We'll say, well, it means to be in awe of the Lord. But actually, I think fear means fear. And I think what fear, we often give fear a bad rap, but there's something about it. I have one memory I have was being on a mission trip to Nicaragua. And we had a day where we went to go see a volcano. And I was with a bunch of high school students, and there was this sign, but the sign was in Spanish, so we ignored it and just walked past it. And it turns out we weren't supposed to go past that sign. And we got to the edge of this volcano, and you could see just smoke rising and steam, and there's this like fiery abyss. Like it was pretty terrifying. And I think I experienced maybe for one of the first times like true, full, like bodily fear that like I could fall into this abyss if a wind gust was right, or this thing could erupt at any moment. And like, there was something so, and it's an interesting word, but they're almost intoxicating about it, right? Because there's something about fear, about the untamed beauty of God that we can't even, like the scriptures even describe moments where people come into the presence of God and what do? They fall face first into the ground or they turn away because they can't even look. It's so much for them to fathom. And that fear, I think, is actually what Jesus is tapping into a little bit. That there is something about our reverence and awe towards God that causes us to just stop and think. This warning from Jesus should be a wake-up call to snap us out of our apathy, to make us ask hard questions about our life, because Jesus' vision for this life is not an ideology. It's a way of life, mind and body and soul and all of us and everything that we do. If Jesus was just some creative rabbi and teacher, that would be different. But he claims to be something far greater. And I believe he is. So you go to the end of the warning. What did he say? When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he had taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. You see, the rabbi style of the day was to quote the rabbi who went before you. So he would say, Rabbi so-and-so said this. But notice Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't invoke another name. He doesn't try to call on the former teacher before him. He just simply says this. And what do the people say? This man spoke with authority, which was wholly unique in that time. Eugene Peterson says it like this, and I think he words it so well. He translated the New Testament, and this is what he said. When Jesus concluded his address, the crowd burst into applause. They had never heard teaching like this. It was apparent that he was living everything he was saying. Quite a contrast to their religious teachers. This was the best teaching he had ever heard. They had ever heard. Why is it the best teaching they had ever heard? Interesting, I think Eugene's translation is right, because Jesus was not just saying things, he embodied them, he lived them. He was living them out, and the way he taught, it had a different kind of authority. He's not just a conduit of truth, but he is truth himself. You know, one of the challenges in the culture we're living in is that we're kind of living in the midst of a bit of a cultural storm. There are so many different voices that are trying to form us, make us see the world in a certain way. And that is just like we're getting so much information, that information is changing in the ways in which we're getting that information, less so in books, but now it's in podcast form or in social media, in Instagram reels and TikTok or whatever medium that we're seeing this information come into the world for our young people. And I just want to share this story because I think it illustrates this well. There's a story going back to the great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a genius, if you don't know anything about him. Karl Barth, he's the guy who wrote the 1,200 word book that was one of the most boring books I read in seminary, but it was really good. He called Bonhoeffer a genius at 21. So at 21 years of age, Bonhoeffer was known to be this kind of genius. He started this community, which was kind of like a seminary for young people, where he was discipling and training pastors, and the guy was just on a different wavelength. And there was this young historian named William Neisel who had heard of Bonhoeffer, and he questioned him. He went to go see him. He traveled all this way, and he says, "Why are you so intense about all of this? Like, what's the big deal?" Bonhoeffer said, "I want you to come with me." They got in a boat. They rowed over across the body of water to this hill, and they climbed this hill. And overlooking the hill, they saw rows and rows and rows of soldiers in the Third Reich, Nazi Germany. And Bonhoeffer looked at Willem and said, "Look, what we're doing back there has to be stronger than what's happening here. The way in which we are discipling these young leaders has to be stronger than the way the world is discipling and brainwashing so many people." And the reality is we're living in a culture where all information is just immediately able to access anyone at any time. And right now, the work of building that firm foundation is so incredibly important. The work we're doing, returning to the teachings of Jesus, modeling what it is to forgive one another, modeling what it is to show radical hospitality to our neighbors. Like, these are the practices and the things that are going to be seen by the outside world and say, what they're doing is different. It has a different kind of authority by living out our faith. And so I want to close by just giving you this little mantra. It's really simple. This is something you can remember. You can say it to your family, to your friends. I was taught this by one of the first mentors I had, Dave McKechnie. He said, Jesus was asked, "What is the greatest commandment? How do I live out my faith?" And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and mind." And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And he summed it up like this. Dave would say, love God, love people, and then prove it. Love God, love people, and then prove it. That's my encouragement to you as you go. Will you pray with me? Lord, help us to do that. I pray that passages like this would sort of stir us from our apathy in the ways in which we've kind of grown complicit in just following whatever cultural narratives and whatever influences that come outside of the truth of your word. I pray that we'd be reminded again and again of your teachings, that they are true. They aren't what save us, but they are the way in which we are to live into the kingdom life. And so we thank you for your grace and your mercy, that it was you who lived the perfect life so that we could have life through you. We thank you that you're a Savior who doesn't just give us information, but desires to have relationship with us, to form us, to change us, to transform us. And so help us as we go forward as a church, as a community, not just to hear your words, but to model them, to live them out in our city and in the world. We pray all these things. It's for your beautiful name. Amen.